Following Beth is like playing my clarinet after Yo-Yo Ma, and I stopped playing it in 8th grade, or serving dessert after Alice Waters cooked dinner, but I'll do my best. Beth and I, by the way, are each half of the time slot of our previous speakers. We're sort of sharing St. Louis together. I have a very long personal history of working with Dan Kiley, studying Dan Kiley. Is that going to be? Before I get into that, I just have to have a couple of thank yous. Beth is certainly right to describe the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Project as extremely complicated, and the fact of the matter is that there are really just two things that I'm going to focus on today, which is the theme of nature and naturalism and the forest and the woods that Kiley and Saarinen worked on, and then the work that we're doing to invigorate the project, and by the way, to stick quite closely to it being a renovation through technical and biotic systems that we're introducing. I want to just say that we're very fortunate that with the National Park Service, we have Tom Bradley as the superintendent of JNEM. He's an incredibly wise guy in a sprawling federal agency. And I also am personally grateful to a number of people in the firm who have worked on this project with me, and many of whom are here today, including Gulliver Shepard, who led the competition effort, and James Smith, who came on and has helped manage it with Gulliver, and also Andrew Gutterman and Christopher Donahue, who specifically have worked on the Kiley piece. So there were a couple of things that we really focused on in terms of our competition entry, and they were, I guess if you were to say any generalization about the Saarinen and Kiley project, the further you go from the arch, the less it's pure Kiley and Saarinen, and more it's the consequence of compromise, but in the good sense of that word, of a project that evolved over the course of 20 years of history, while relatively young designers became, to the middle point, the sort of the center of their work, two men with an incredible life of collaboration. So a focus for us on this project were the edges, and some of you may know the Eads Bridge, a magnificent bridge which is at the northern boundary of the site. This is the condition as it exists today, and the southern edge is not a lot better. I don't have a picture of it, but it's a maintenance building. A central idea of our project was to, the fundamental hope of the project, besides the reinvigoration of a modern masterpiece, is to hotwire it more successfully into St. Louis. What happens now mostly is many visitors come, they go into the garage the picture of which I just showed you, which is not exactly a joyful beginning of a visitor experience, and to pop out of the roof and walk across the grounds to the arch, and then to repeat that journey and leave. So the centerpiece of our plan, or a centerpiece besides the invigoration of the edges, is to relocate a new entry that still is a 5-minute walk, but to relocate that parking from underground structures and to use existing parking garages in the downtown, to use contemporary modes of of electronic ticketing and advanced arrangements for parking so that the visitor arrives in St. Louis and experiences the city as part of the act of going to the Arch grounds. The removal of the garage on the north end will allow us to recontour this area, to fold it back down, and to create at-grade connections through the apertures in the Eads Bridge and to facilitate a continuity that doesn't exist presently. The other thing that happened during the 20-year span of time between Kiley and Saarinen winning the competition and construction was the construction of this Interstate 70. They thought it was going to be better for the grounds because it was underground, but in some ways it's all the more horrific. Besides all the noise, there's an incredible sense of separation that it creates. And then the potential that once, so our scheme is to create a cap over that moment at the beginning of the Gateway Mall, and then our work extends into the mall, including the redesign of Keener Plaza, which is 1.5 blocks up from the Nelson Bird Wolt's fantastic city gardens. And we're working with the same client, Peter Fisher, on this piece. So this is the view looking towards the new entry that James Carpenter and Cooper Robertson are currently working on. And then lastly, in terms of the side towards St. Louis, the reimagining of the Lenore K. Sullivan Boulevard and bringing back the notion of this as a place of the arrival of major culture and material things through traffic on the Mississippi, and our plan to make the entire Arch grounds compliant with contemporary standards for Americans with disabilities. And I suppose foreigners with disabilities could use those ramps as well. We'll, I don't know, that might not fare well in Congress right now if we brought that up. Not that they're going to give us any money to build this. This is where we were at the end of the competition a year and a half ago. This has changed rather dramatically to this, which I'll explain as we get a little bit further along. So I have to tell you, Jane, you're going to give me a 5-minute flash, right? By the way, you missed one of the great standoffs of James, the hockey player, being stopped now, signed by Jane, and Jane, the intellectual hockey player, and James, the real hockey player, and James charging forward, and Jane shaking her sign at him. He finally stopped. But I have a long history with Kiley. He's a hero, without a doubt, and I have some great collaborations in my life. With architects and with artists, and certainly within my practice. But the thing that he and Saarinen had, and the way that they influenced each other's practices, is amazing. For me, when I graduated from Cornell in 1973, yep, I turned 60 this year, I won the Dumbarton Oak Summer Garden Fellowship, and the project was to go and visit all of Dan Kiley's completed projects. The Arch wasn't completed then. So I did about half of the visiting, and then I went to Vermont to see Dan. But when I got there, he forgot I was coming, which was the beginning of a long series of such encounters between Dan and me. But it was truly formative. So I saw the Miller Garden, which he and really Kevin Roche in the Saarinen office created in '55, and what I consider to be the great Kiley masterpiece, the Chicago Art Institute, which is even more spectacular than when I saw it. So when I started teaching at Harvard 10 years later, I was on the tenure track, and I was, oh God, how am I going to do this? And I really want to be a designer, but I have to be an academic. So I curated the Built Landscapes exhibit, also because I thought that design as I had learned it at Cornell, was faltering at that particular time, and there were some great unsung people, Dan among them. When I called Dan to ask him to be in the show, he was highly resistant. He didn't like Farron being in the show. He really didn't like A.E. Bai being in the show. He didn't like James Rose as a person. While all this was going on, he shrank his sweater, and then he didn't like me because he said it was my fault. But I said, well, if you'll just agree to be in the show, I can, get off the phone and, you can still go on your skiing trip. And he said, well, if you'll add Fletcher Steele, I'm in. I didn't know who Fletcher Steele is. That was a great ad on his part, but I think it's very telling that he wanted to include a landscape architect whose work so prominently, I think, brought us up to the edge of modernism in landscape architecture. So Beth, you had that great picture of old Dan. This is probably what Arrow and Dan sort of looked like when they did the competition in the 40s. The thing I want to concentrate on here is this forestal landscape between the Arch grounds and downtown. And even though we're going to see that Kiley reluctantly evolved that landscape to something quite different, very central from the beginning of the project was a landscape which actually, if it had been realized this way, would have been a radical addition to the body of work that Dan had created. This is nearly a 40-acre forest. Now, he envisioned this as being just one or two species of trees, but it was an incredibly powerful idea. I think that if we were to characterize modernism in a couple of tenets, we would say that there was always a very controlling idea about nature. And certainly if we fast forward modernism to the work that followed, and particularly the time that we occupy now, we see the work that most landscape urbanists are doing, for instance, and practitioners generally, I think that there's a very different way that we dance with nature in our work. There was a very kind of hostile relationship to the idea of nature, and yet we see Kiley perennially kind of coming up to the edge of being very excited by it, kind of titillated by it. In fact, in the conversation when I went to interview Dan, I asked him how he defined what a bosque was, and he's, as Dan would say, well, that's when trees are on a grid and they're 15 feet on center. Perhaps, there could have been a comma and a couple of other qualifications of that. And I said, well, what happens, Dan, when trees start to die in the bosque? And he shot right back at me, well, that's when a bosque starts to get good. And clearly here he was embracing the idea of the aleatory, of the notion of chance coming into the work of landscape architecture. And I would say that the distinguishing quality in the work of landscape architects from, let's just round this off and say 1955 and what's fast forwarding to today, is that we have a much more comfortable idea of engaging the possibility of things that we don't completely control being part of our work through the aleatory. And it's interesting to me because the notion of chance is such an important player in other creative disciplines all the way through the 20th century. And there are landscape architects that brought that into their work, but they're not really the sung heroes the way Dan is. So we have a quick evolution of the plan for you. And what does that sign say, Jane? Because I don't have my glasses on. Okay. 10 minutes? It says 10 minutes? I can't hear you, Jane. And I can't see you either. Okay. All right. I'll go very fast. So very, very quickly, and we've tried, Chris Donahue did a huge amount of this putting of work together. So when I say we, it's mostly Chris. But we have tried to keep clear by saying Saarinen, that the drawing is from the Saarinen office. We're not, if you read the Cultural Landscape Report, you understand that all the way through there was a very close back and forth collegial thing going on with the two of them. But it's very interesting to see how the plan changes from 47 to 48 when they win the second stage. The the adjustment of the symmetry of the arch comes into play, and then the Korean War breaks out, and there's the debt that the federal government has after that. But the other problem is that Saarinen is fighting with the railroad. I would have loved to have known him. The hubris must have been extreme, but he was convinced that he would get the railroad to move. I think we all know more about railroads today than that. So he worked for a very long time, but it's very interesting how this infrastructural piece of the city, the railroad, influenced the development of the plan and how much better the plan got as a consequence of that. The kind of grand moment is when this parabolic language of Saarinen comes into the plan. We begin to see this is basically the bones of the plan that we all love. And there's lots of things to not love there, but you have to. If you don't love this part of this plan, I don't want to know you. Please don't speak to me after today. But, you know, it's this, right? I mean, this is Saarinen, and I'm sure many of you have thought many times, as I have, you know, wow, if Saarinen hadn't died so unexpectedly in his early 50s, you know, where would this work have gone? Because this is so amazing. But it's interesting to me how the culture, the larger culture of the time is drawn into the work that Saarinen and Kiley did, and the beginning of the evolution of the grading plans. We see here, though, a really dramatical departure from where the plan was 11 years earlier in the clearing that started to be created, and I suppose in the practical reality of the fact that they were contouring, dishing these large meadows of land, and there was a huge volume of water that was being created, and the opportunity of these reflecting ponds, which are also extremely interesting to follow their evolution. Certainly, you know, the biomorphic preoccupation of the period, and certainly Saarinen would have been more than familiar with the work of Aalto. But it's great to see how then Kiley works temporarily. I'm sure he probably is looking down on me very crossly that I even showed this with his name on it, but there was this time when the office generated a miniaturization of the Oregon and Santa Fe trail on the site. And it's the beginning of the sort of undoing of his relationship. 2 minutes. You got it, darling. So then the evolution of these amazing alleys, just incredible. Unfortunately, they're already deteriorating, and the emerald ash borer is not super far away. Here we are. We see Kiley now involved. We see though a very dramatic transformation of the planting from the kind of young, robust idea of the forest in 1948, and something that we characterized. Joe Carr, who I interviewed a couple weeks ago, just said Dan told them to make the plantings that was more park-like, and that's, Beth, not a typology that showed up on your list, because we, like you, I imagine, I find that a very curious aspiration on their part. So I just want to, I still have a minute and a half left. I want to rush forward. So this is what, of course, Dan loses the commission. The Park Service, for many reasons, we don't know exactly why, and the Park Service takes over the realization of the project. The arch is built, and nearly another decade goes by until they even start to plant the arch grounds. This is where we are today. So, unfortunately, besides the chagrin we all feel about the switch to the ash trees and the imminence of their potential demise by this new insect, the ground conditions that these are planted in are extremely inferior, and many of the trees are already dying because of that. In talking about the landscape all the time through all the narrative, and the cultural report, landscape report goes into this as well, there was the desire not to make what we call a mow, blow, and go landscape, which is trees and lawns, which is effectively what's there today. And this is a Peter Kerr Walker sketch, I believe. And you can see in the conversations with Dan and Saarinen, there's all of this intent of having a much more robust ground surface, which Dan never really got to detail. What we have on the grounds is sad in some ways because the project was built with such a limited budget, but also I'm reminded, because I was practicing in this time, of how naive we were about, I'll stop at the end of the next paragraph, I promise, how naive we were about soils. So we have in the ponds this incredible eutrophic condition that develops, this algae. And what we know about algae is that it's very easy to control by eliminating the level of phosphorus. It's extremely simple plant form, 4 ingredients and a little oxygen, really, and you just take out the phosphorus and you can get rid of it. Part of the way of doing that is to go from lawns and to turn these into conservation mode lawns, different grass species, and at various heights between 6 and 9 inches, which is certainly closer to what Saarinen and Kiley were aspiring to. So nearly the last image, the existing pond landscape, we get to regrade that very, very slightly when we roll in the 5% ramps for access with people with movement disabilities in wheelchairs, and then to recontour the edge of the pond, to run water through these grass swales as part of the remediation, and then the creation of these small wetlands at the edges of the ponds where the infiltration happens. Right now, the contouring of the land actually pitches the water directly into the basin. So by not changing the edges physically and depressing them slightly and recontouring, we're able to collect the water and take the phosphorus out. Thank you very much.